What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And on August 26th, 2024, we got a pretty major announcement for the Modern format where Nadu Winged Wisdom, the card that was all but banned in the format and essentially excommunicated from the format from as many possible places as it could be excommunicated from before it was even legally banned, is now banned, and a card that was maybe a year overdue for banning and probably is decent to okay-ish now to kind of let stick around the format in terms of how many decks were actually playing it, in Grief being banned from the format. So pretty interesting stuff. Usually what we do when we have these banned and restricted announcements, we kind of look at some winners and losers. Even if there's no changes, there are definitely some winners and losers of the format, and I think with this banned and restricted announcement, it ended up being pretty decent for all parties involved. I think there is some, at least one toxic play pattern that was kind of taken out of the format, and really, I guess, a few if you include Nadu, just because I think that was kind of a given. But, with now scam decks essentially dead, where you're not going to see yourself getting double thought seized on turn one, whether facing down a 4-power threat or a 3-power threat with the potential of getting a third card knocked out of your hand, we definitely have a pretty huge impact on the Modern format. And we're going to be going over some winners and losers and making some little predictions here today. So, of course, if you want to see more videos like this, you want to see me talk more about the Modern and Pioneer format, as well as some other longer form videos, I implore you to subscribe and ring notification bell so you know when those videos get posted in the future, as it is a free and easy way to support me and my content. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers before the regional championship. I had the goal before the end of the year. I didn't think we were going to come close to hitting it, or it was going to be down to the wire, and we've actually just blown it out of the water. So that's definitely a goal of mine, is to hit it before the regional championship at the beginning of August. So if you're watching this, please consider subscribing, all that fun stuff. Show some support for me. I appreciate all the support I've gotten up to this point, and we're going to be hopefully expanding on some things and doing some cool stuff when we get to 1,000. So make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, all that kind of stuff. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at some of our winners, losers, and some predictions for the Modern format going forward after our August 26th, 2024 ban list. So I think the first set of winners, I don't think this is exclusively to Modern, but I think this kind of extends to all players that are kind of into the competitive season or will get into, competitive Magic going forward. We have a change in the cadence of the BNR announcements. So instead of them being about a month after a new set release, meaning that we got them probably about 4 to 6 times a year, they're going to more in line with some of the results and the things that we're seeing from, RCQs at the RCs and even at the Pro Tour level. This will hopefully ensure that there will be better banning announcements and a better check on things going into the RCQ season, mainly because we got to start about a month, probably like a few weeks to a month of the Modern RCQ season, with Nadu being legal, with it essentially being all but banned, and it being by far the best thing that you could be doing in the format. Just kind of incentivize players to buy into it, even though if you wanted to win, you had to buy into it, so it kind of is a feel bad because that it's going to be banned, but you kind of have no reason to not play it because it is just that powerful. We've seen Cedric Phillips make it to the finals of plenty of RCQs and then just concede in the finals after just going undefeated X-0 in those tournaments. It's pretty insane. So I would say the player base as a whole, kind of with the different cadence of the BNR, I think are overall winners, and of course I think the Modern players are winners because now we have essentially a Hogak level threat, exiled from the competitive scene, and now we just kind of get to look forward to what decks are going to continue to dominate. Obviously, with Grief also getting the ban hammer as well, that makes a lot of decks, or at least a few decks that I think were very powerful and look pretty good, even in kind of a Nadu meta, end up being a lot worse now that the Grief is no longer legal, and also some other fringe-ish type strategies as well, now that Grief is gone. But I think overall winners, the Modern player base has definitely got some cheering to do for, just obviously banning one of the most obviously broken things in the format currently, on top of, really not getting scammed anymore. And then, of course, the player base as a whole for the, the BNR announcements being more in line with the competitive season rather than set releases, which could get awkward when you're looking at, the huge competitive level events that you're looking to kind of showcase some of these new sets and some of these new cards that are in a format that hopefully when you show it on camera ends up looking really healthy and getting players wanting to be involved in it, whether it be a diversity or just some of the cool things going on. So that's kind of the outside of the players sort of thing, like outside of the game thing. We'll go ahead and we're going to look at some of the decks that are, some winners and losers from this as well. I think starting off, one of the biggest winners is actually Ruby Storm. I just kind of like in the early parts of the formats, being these decks that can go really, really fast, and we know that the Ruby Storm deck is capable of winning games as early as turn 2 and having multiple different ways, albeit having to invest maybe some more resources into a turn 2 kill if it doesn't have Strike It Rich on turn 1. But decks like this, I really enjoy. I think that, people are going to kind of stick to playing like the control decks, playing the ring decks, and I think a lot of them are just going to kind of gravitate towards the ring, because I think a lot of decks have a harder time trying to beat your opponent drawing 3, 6, 10 cards and then playing another ring, reestablishing protection, and getting to continue to draw cards while you're also getting beat down by Flage. Ruby Storm, in a way, I don't think really cares too much just because of this card, Alchemist Gambit, like in the sideboard, where you take an extra turn, and then during that turn, damage can't be prevented, which circumvents the ring, drawback, or I guess rather for your opponent, where they have protection until their next turn. So if you would normally take an extra turn, your opponent would still have protection, but thanks to Alchemist Gambit and that line of text, the damage can't be prevented, which means that you can kind of go off and do your thing. I think that Force Negation maybe is a little bit okay, is like still a very good card. I think free counter spells are still just very powerful in this new format that we're looking at. But I think with Grief getting banned and some of these other decks getting a little bit worse, especially since a resource-intensive deck like the Storm deck will just be able to kind of thrive in a format where people aren't double Thoughtseizing you on turn 1. And I think in general, just the card Thoughtseize is down and more people are playing like the One Ring. I think this deck will be more than okay with kind of getting to circumvent, the protection from the ring. It definitely has ways of getting around it. Plus, if your opponent just never has like Force of Negation, or even at times where if they leave up multiple counter spells, you're able to play through multiple counters with this deck. So from what I would expect to be on top of the metagame, where we have Boros Energy and, Mardu Energy kind of getting to stick around and do their thing. I think Ruby Storm not really being affected by Blood Moon, getting to having the ability to play around the different counter spells that we can see in the format with, either Jeskai control or like even 4-color control kind of being around, or any of the other like Force and Negation style decks. I think it's going to be able to race just about any other combo deck with any sort of like decent draw that it has. And again, like forcing your opponent to use a bunch of resources to kind of answer some of your things is fine. Even if you get like Force and Negation, they spent 2 cards to stop your 1 card, and usually it's going to end up being something like a Past in Flames maybe. And if you play any amount of Storm, you're able to kind of like play around, Force and Negation on like one of your big payoff spells like Past in Flames, or you can just get off like some value like Grape Shots and things like that. Also getting them in like your sideboard and empty the Warrens if need be. I think this deck just has a lot going for it now, especially in an early metagame. People might be targeting Storm, and that's totally fine. I think that you're kind of like a big game 1 deck, and you just try to steal a sideboard game in game 2 and game 3. And I think with just like the speed of this deck and everybody trying to figure out like maybe what's good and what isn't good, running the risk of potentially losing to something like a Boros Energy or a Mardu Energy is kind of the risk that you take, because you're either going to probably lose the Storm or you're going to lose to that deck. And I think it's going to be decently hard to try to like metagame. I mean, you can, I guess, build towards theoretically both of them, but then there's like all the other ring decks / Eldrazi decks that are definitely got better now that Grief is not hanging around. So, that is kind of like one of my early winners for the format. Ruby Storm, I think it's going to be a pretty good option going forward. I think it's hard to kind of knock, again, the deck that, can win the game on turn 2 and definitely has some resilience against, potentially multiple counter spells played against it, and, really forcing your opponent to have some really good knowledge of, playing against the Storm deck. And even then, there's just times where you can just outright win the game and just kind of like bully the control player for not having enough interaction for what you got going on. Plus the fact that those decks are probably going to mostly have to tune for something like a Boros Energy or a Mardu Energy, where they're going to have to try to find ways to get rid of something like a Blood Moon. They're going to have to, be able to clear the board from like Ocelot Pride. So you're going to see probably a decent amount of, Wrath of the Skies and Supreme Verdicts and the Galvanic Discharges and things like that, where this deck for the most part doesn't really care about them. I mean, Ral in a way can kind of circumvent it by just having like multiple, being able to cast multiple spells with a Ral in play and then flipping it to then kind of blank the Galvanic Discharge. Of course, if they have a second one, it could be definitely different. But ultimately speaking, Ral can kind of dodge some of that removal as well. So I think a really good deck going forward. And I don't know why I'm getting an advertisement, but that's Storm. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of the losers and kind of flip-flop back and forth here. So I think one of the, maybe not the biggest loser, but definitely a loser of the format is Esper Goros. While this deck wasn't necessarily, Grief Ephemerate wasn't like necessarily the ideal game plan. It was still very powerful. The fact that you could scam your opponent on turn one with Grief plus Ephemerate, take their cards, and then if you really needed to, you could then rebound the Ephemerate on the Grief and get a third card out of your opponent's hand. Still have a 3-2 in play. Like, their board state is all but decimated, and of course, would have been that way anyway. If you just got to Grief plus Ephemerate them on turn one. Of course, like, your backup plan, in a way, is just playing, like, Psychic Frog or, like, Priest of the Fell Rites and then getting back, like, Atraxa or Gristlebrand, and then just absolutely decimating your opponent with all the advantage and stuff that you get, on top of getting to Ephemerate these and keep them around after getting them back with Goryo's Vengeance. I think that it just had a lot of... it definitely was really good with the fact that you could do this on like turn one, and even if you didn't do it on turn one, who cares? Like, the turns that you just get to play Grief when you were planning on doing the Goryo's Vengeance thing. Just made sure that you had a clear path of getting your creature back, and then also making sure that you blanked maybe whatever potential removal that they could have for either of those creatures by taking it and then getting to Ephemerate it, bringing it back, getting you some additional value. Atraxa more than likely being able to set you up to do the same thing over again, and Gristlebrand getting you to draw a bunch of cards, of course being worse in a Bowmaster format. Still getting to draw 7 cards or draw 14 cards with Gristlebrand, and getting to sculpt the perfect 7 out of 14 cards is, some would argue pretty good. Psychic Frog gave you kind of like a level of, control where it's like, okay, if I draw it as like my land for turn, or if I draw it for turn, Psychic Frog, I can ditch it to the frog, I can grow it, and then hit for more damage and kind of put pressure on my opponent and force them to deal with this instead of leaving something for like Atraxa or Gristlebrand or things like that. So definitely a loser for sure, because I think it lost one of its really good game plans, and I think what a lot of people were using Grief for nowadays was to make sure that they could clear the way for their spells and stuff to go through. Especially getting to resolve like Goryo's Vengeance and things like that, or make sure that their Ephemerate was going to be good to keep their Atraxa or the Gristlebrand around. But ultimately, I think that the deck just kind of goes to playing a little bit more of like as a resilient deck. You're just kind of like, it is what it is, here you go. And then Psychic Frog is able to kind of like pound through damage and like really kind of like set you up to, put your opponent in a spot where, okay, you need to answer this frog or it's going to kill you. And as soon as you come up with an answer for the frog, I'm going to be able to cast, like, play Goryo's Vengeance and get something back that's even more threatening. But like, even then, like, it's kind of like dealing with like the frog now and then, Atraxas and stuff later. So overall, I'm not necessarily thinking that this deck is close to unplayable. I think it's still going to be a decent threat in like the metagame, but it definitely isn't, doing something pretty broken in the standards of like other decks that just get to kind of loop the One Ring and then interact with your opponent in very meaningful ways to then, kind of force them out of their game plan. And of course, with Boros Energy / Mardu Energy being the perceived top decks of the format going forward, and I really wouldn't consider them like winners, because like Nadu, like they were still able to kind of beat Nadu, and I think they were probably, one of the better decks to just be playing in the format, period. So I don't think this deck really necessarily cares about like Boros Energy either. I mean, just the fact that like if you just a Trax of them on like turn 2 or turn 3, and you just gain a bunch of life. And it's like, unless they have like multiple Ocelot Prides going and Goblin Bombardment, like I really wouldn't be worried if I was playing this deck against Boros Energy. So yeah, but that's like one of my losers, Goryo's Vengeance. It's kind of a loser in the fact that, again, it lost like its way of getting to interact with its opponent for free on like the turn that you're going to be able to go for Goryo's plus Ephemerate. Even then, like, again, setting up where you can just take 2 cards out of their hand and then still Goryo's Vengeance something back. And, who cares? Like, if you get back Gristlebrand, it's like, okay, I'm going to draw 14 cards. Like, I'm going to set up the perfect 7 from here and then be able to do this again, like, on the next turn. So, overall, still a great deck. Definitely worse. I would still probably put it maybe, like, in the tier 1.5, where, like, maybe it could still be tier 1. It just has to definitely change some things around now that Grief is not legal. So, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our next winner of the format. So another winner of the format is like the E-Tron, like the different Tron variants, and essentially like all the ring decks. The fact that, again, looping ring is a very powerful thing, getting to draw a bunch of cards and then even have a turn where you draw 4 or 5 cards and then playing another ring, reestablishing protection. Your opponent's not going to be able to really pressure you all that much outside of like a few fringe cases. Of course, you're going to get to continue to draw more cards as well. And you would have essentially drawn, however many cards on like the last ring plus 1 for the cost of like 1 damage, which is like nothing when you've drawn like essentially 5 or 6 cards from that point. So very annoying gameplay pattern to deal with. And in like the case of these Tron decks where you get to play Karn the Great Creator, where we would see like Haywire Might being like a really good way of dealing with the 1 ring. Karn the Great Creator can just get it back even after they've gotten the 1 ring from their sideboard, because for some reason this also gets artifacts from exile. Whatever, I guess. Also, being able to kind of power things out thanks to Ugin's Labyrinth, where, thanks to Devourer of Destinies, you're going to be able to, a lot of the time, dig for an Ugin's Labyrinth, get 2 mana in play your Talisman of Resilience, and then you're able to play like a ring on turn 2, if able, and then, of course, getting to play like Thought Knots here as well, enabling plays like that, enabling Karn the Great Creator to eventually go and get some of these things. Maybe you can get Tormod's Crypt on turn 2 for like some of the graveyard decks. Just overall, a really annoying deck to kind of deal with. It has a lot of things that were already going for it that made it like decent against some of the Nadu decks in the format, and I want to say that like this was like kind of the deck that wanted to avoid it, because in theory, like Nadu could still just like put a bunch of tokens into play, do the thing, blow up all their lands, and you have like 1 basic forest. So like, you were going to be left with just that after the Nadu player like comboed off. So the fact that Karn the Great Creator like is good against Shuko, but like not good against the Outrider Encore, just overall made this deck, like probably, I think people said it was like a bad matchup. I could definitely see some cases where you kind of have some things going for you in terms of, trying to combat the matchup. But I think a lot of decks were pretty much, donezo when we didn't really interact early with like the Nadu decks and things like that. So, overall, I think this deck gets a lot better. It gets the ability to just play 4 1 ring and continue to like loop them while also getting to hit your land drops, eventually assemble Tron and start playing some of these big destructive Eldrazi's, especially like Kozilek's Command, also getting to mess with the graveyard, scry a bunch to find like a threat that you need and then draw a card, removal, make a bunch of tokens to then be able to power out some of these other things, make giant walking ballistas, get to play this Karn Wish board to really mess with your opponent even further. I think Eldrazi Tron, like all the other Tron variants, definitely get a lot better with this banned restricted announcement, getting rid of a potential bad matchup. And of course, too, like not getting griefed out of the game, even though this deck, definitely is incentivized to mulligan pretty deep for things like Devourer Destiny to try to get like the turn 2 Ugin's Labyrinth, or make sure that, you have a hand that can sculpt Tron together. Well, again, this deck I don't think is like super important in like E-Tron to really get Tron, but it definitely is very reminiscent of a Tron deck than it is Eldrazi Tron. So, definitely something to kind of think about. But I think decks like this and, like the Through the Breach variants and stuff are in a pretty good position going forward in Modern. where, even like if your opponent plays like the One Ring, when you threw the Breach and Emrakul into play, they still have to sacrifice like 6 permanents. They just won't take damage. I believe it's just like the defending player sacrifices the permanents. So, they're still in pretty bad shape, even if they have the ring around. Like, a lot of like what the ring is good at doing is, kind of like furthering your advantage and, eventually just kind of like pulling you farther and farther ahead. And it's hard to pull far ahead when you have to sacrifice like all your lands and potentially other permanents as well. With like the One Ring in play, because now you're not going to be able to, reset it for a few turns, and then you're kind of stuck like wanting to draw cards because, that's just the thing that you do with the ring, and I think it just takes a lot of discipline. And I think a deck like this and some of the other Eldrazi decks definitely get a lot better going forward now that the best deck in the format's gone. One of the best ways, or maybe not necessarily one of the best ways, but a way to further punish these decks that really want to mulligan aggressively as well, getting scammed, no longer a thing. So I would expect that these decks end up getting better in the long term. Or in the short term for sure. In the long term, we'll kind of see how things shake out. But I have a hard time believing that anything involving the One Ring is going to be bad in this format, unless they print like another Bowmaster that you can play like 8 copies of in your black decks. Then I could definitely see people doing that. But chances are that's not happening. So we're just going to kind of stick with the One Ring being one of the best things that you can do in the format up until it ultimately gets banned. I think here probably within like the next like 6 months, I would say. But yeah, that is e-tron. That's one of our winners. Let's go ahead and take a look at another loser of the format. Continuing to lose in the modern format is Living End, of course, with the banning of Violent Outburst, I believe like a while ago at this point. It kind of lost its ability to play at instant speed and be able to leave up its combo for Force Negation. Of course, it would still see considerable play here and there. People would just kind of like gravitate towards it because it is still a deck that could just run over your opponent. And with the fact that you'd want to play for Grief as well as just kind of the same way of like Goryo's Vengeance, this could like clear the way while you weren't going to be getting it back, or, by ephemerating it or not dead after alling it. It was still good enough just to like look at your opponent's hand, just say, okay, they don't really have anything to interact with it. I'm going to go and take this card, and then I'm going to cast an Ardent Plea or a Shardless Agent. I'm going to cascade into this Living End card, and we're just going to flop all these into play. We're going to get to take another card out of their hand with Grief. We're going to have a bunch of these, big flyers here. Even like with multiple Architectural Wills, you can look at a player's library and then put them back in any order. Just overall, like getting to play a lot of these cheap cyclers, put a lot of things into the graveyard, and then have the ability to just kind of check and see, like, am I going to be able to get this through or not? Use Force Negation as like a way to defend against the hand hate, where you could see other people maybe trying to not dead after all Grief, even though this more than likely won't work unless you have multiple copies of Force Negation. Also just other decks like playing Thoughtseize and Inquisition and things like that to stop them from taking Ardent Plea or Shardless Agent from the deck. Just like I think in terms of like graveyard-based decks, I think that the Living End deck gets a lot worse than the Goryo's Vengeance deck. I still think Living End is like an okay option. I think the fact that a deck that can just put essentially lethal power into play on a turn where you decide to take the shields down, or that you have to invest multiple resources in just making sure that you add to your board, plus also decks having to leave up Force Negation for the Living End. If they're playing control, and of course if you're just playing like Boros Energy, like who cares? Like this is just like a one-sided board wipe. So I think if Boros Energy continues to be one of the better decks in the format, or like the best deck in the format, we could definitely see some things going on. It just also has to compete against something like blue-white control, or rather like the Jeskai control or 4-color control list, where they have plenty of options in dealing with a board full of creatures that they may or may not be able to target. And of course Grief not getting to essentially ensure that they have to like top deck they're ensuring that they have to like top deck it or anything like that, or get lucky and draw it off like the ring. It just doesn't have that option anymore. Maybe gets replaced by some of these other like cyclers and stuff that have existed in the deck. But overall, I see this deck taking, like a pretty big drop and maybe not seeing too much play, if any. Like the diehards will probably still play Living End. They'll find a way to like tune it and have it find success in the format, but I don't expect it to be kind of like a major player in the format anytime soon, especially with some of the other decks that have gotten better from these bannings and that are going to abuse broken things like the One Ring going forward, where this deck doesn't seem like it's going to be able to do that. Or maybe it will, just replace Grief with the One Ring and, again, get to draw a bunch of cards and kind of like force things through that way. But, I don't see that happening. I see Living End just kind of being kind of like relegated to like the tier 2, tier 3 of the format. Like still a deck that like maybe you have to keep an eye out for and you kind of have to like wonder how you're going to play against it. But overall, like definitely being a lot less of a threat than it was, a year ago when it had Grief and the Violent Outburst is still legal. So that's another loser of the format. Let's go ahead and try to wrap things up with some predictions of the format kind of going forward. So overall, what do we think is going to happen to the Modern format going forward? I think very obviously it's hard to dethrone like Boros Energy / Mardu Energy from its throne. I think it was one of the better decks. I don't think it's necessarily the best deck. I think Nadu was very clearly the best deck in the format. But I think if you were going to be someone that wasn't playing Nadu, you either had to be playing a deck that either could, consistently maybe be a little bit faster, also kind of have some pretty unfair-ish things going on where, you just had like multiple Ocelot Pride, multiple Guide of Souls, and, the Goblin Bombardment, or just getting to Blood Moon your opponent, like basically doing all the unfair things by doing, other than doing the most unfair thing, which was obviously just playing Nadu. So I think very hard to kind of do that. I think Mardu gets marginally better than the just straight Boros variants. I think we'll see a situation where I think Boros Energy will be better against Mardu Energy, just because Mardu Energy is going to want to have their access to the third color so they can like Chthonian Nightmare and kind of loop their threats and just overall be a very, very, very grindy deck in the format. And I think Boros Energy, with just having access to Blood Moon and being able to play around its own Blood Moon and then also be able to interact with some of its creatures and potentially race on the play, that we could see that being a pretty interesting mirror with definitely some good ways of like kind of breaking it, where I still think something like a Mardu Energy being probably the better of the two, but I think the Boros Energy deck still being very good and getting to play around kind of like its own Blood Moon and some of the other like land hate cards like the Merfolk that I can never think of its name, getting to turn all your non-basics into islands, which is a lot worse for the deck than, it just getting straight up Blood Moon. So, I guess that's a thing that could potentially happen, but I think it's definitely going to be kind of between them who can shake out the top of the format, and then we're going to be followed by a ton of One Ring decks. As we were saying in the video, I think that, the Eldrazi Tron variants and just the Tron variants in general, I think, things like the Through the Breach deck end up getting a lot better as well, just because the Through the Breach deck can kind of fight through the protection. We also talked about Storm being able to fight through protection kind of in its own way and still be able to kind of set up avenues where it can take that extra turn and kill your opponent. Through the Breach, just getting to put a Emrakul into play, annihilating your opponent. Who cares if they have protection? They have no permanents left. You can definitely figure out a win, especially if you have your own One Ring to kind of use and, draw a bunch of cards. Also, with some of the other things that are played in the deck, where you have like Sowing Microspawn, where you can go and fetch different lands from your deck to ensure that you have enough mana to go after your opponent with a Through the Breach, or getting to kick it and get, Stone Rain your opponent while also ramping yourself as well is really nice. So I think that like Through the Breach and Storm are going to be some really good decks, but I also think you can't really go wrong with playing any deck that's decently established that is playing like the One Ring. That includes like the 4-color control decks. I believe some of the energy decks in general are just starting to pick up like the One Ring, and it's probably going to be one of the best things to do in the format that isn't Boros Energy or Storm or Mardu Energy for the time being, until it probably ultimately gets banned here in probably the next 3 to 6 months. That's kind of what the expectation is for me. So if you haven't already got your rings, go out and get them. Jam as many copies of the ring in your deck, and then just kind of like go to town on your opponent by looping the ring, and then eventually getting to do your thing by either annihilating all their permanents, taking out all their creatures, and then killing them with Flage, or even just getting to like loop Nightmare and stuff, and I guess really loop the creatures with Chthonian Nightmare as well. So some pretty interesting things going on there. I think that these sort of kind of graveyard-based decks are going to go away. I think they're going to be leaning more towards, like the Murktide variants, where we could see like Grixis Murktide. I've seen like a few people putting up results with. I've seen Dimir Murktide, which I think is the kind of go-to version of Murktide now over the Izzet versions, although I can see some of the Izzet versions maybe being leaning more towards being like a wizard deck and getting to play like Flame of Anor and get to use like Snapcaster Mage and stuff to kind of get back some of their pretty nice threats in the graveyard to kind of like outvalue your opponent. Of course, I default towards like the Dimir variants because I think Psychic Frog is going to be absolutely amazing in this format. If you're able to protect it, untap with it, anything like that, you're going to be able to race a lot of your opponents that are maybe not Boros or Mardu Energy, and really like put an emphasis on your opponent having to deal with said card until they actually come up with an answer for it. And even if they do, it has probably done like so much damage at this point, and you've drawn so many extra cards off of it that you should be able to find a way to play another threat, protect it, and be able to kind of close out the game from there. So, I mean, ultimately, we see a lot of these tempo-y, strategies, I think getting a lot better now that Nadu isn't around. And, I think the Boros decks are going to kind of cannibalize each other. And, while they do have some good things going on against the rest of the format, we do have things like the One Ring to kind of combat what is going on. Just don't get, caught by the left-handed Blood Moon, because it definitely sucks getting a Blood Moon, even still in 2024. The losers, I think the graveyard decks do tend to get a little worse. I think a lot of them were using Grief to just make sure that they were able to kind of clear the way. And we kind of see that with the examples of Living End and Goryo's Vengeance. Now, that doesn't mean that some of the mid-range strategies that were using Grief were, necessarily using it to kind of get back or to push through something else. Some of them were using it as the main way of getting to win the game, where we see it Not Dead After All. And even maybe some of the white-black mid-range decks, which I don't know if anyone's actually even playing those, but using Ephemerate as another way to kind of get it back and have it keep it to stay around, while also just getting to play, some of the other cards like Stoneforge Mystic to, put equipment on it and try to close out the game very quickly. I think that we definitely see those decks have to shift towards more of a fair mid-range game plan, which, Ragavan isn't necessarily the dominant force as it was maybe a year or two ago, but it is still a very potent turn one threat. We probably end up seeing a lot of those Rakdos decks end up being more Boros anyway, so that's probably what those players will tend to gravitate towards, because again, those are probably the decks that have the biggest target on their back kind of going forward. And of course, probably the biggest losers of all of them, and probably my prediction for it is all the Nadu people being sad that they actually thought that Nadu was a fair combo deck to play, and that it wasn't probably one of the most busted things to ever come out of a Modern Horizon set, and de facto was the Hogak of that set. Again, I think that Grief is kind of a weird banning. It probably should have been the Ring alongside Grief if that's what you wanted to do. I don't think banning one over the other was necessarily ideal, but we'll kind of see how the format adapts and changes going forward. And yeah, that's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you want to see from the Modern format, maybe some of your own predictions, maybe what you would have wanted to see from the ban list as a whole. I would love to see them and kind of interact with people down in the comments down below, so feel free to do so. But yeah, that's it for me. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.